Hi, we're gonna get started in a minute or two. I just want to come up here and let you guys know a little bit about this series and what it is and what the point of it is and how it is that you can continue to watch what we do and help to support us. So we started this speaker series as an extension of our UA debate team. Our kids travel around to tournaments, and they won their first one actually just 2 weeks ago, so give them a round of applause. We have the most amazing group of interns in the history of the world, so they helped us to put this on. And so we wanted to have this speaker series as a way to sort of elevate discourse, especially at a time when it seems like that's kind of eroding. And we wanted to make sure that everyone knows what the format of our platform usually is going to look like. So tonight what you'll see, we're trying to sort of move debate away from the sort of right-left punditry that it has been, I think, bastardized into being. So we want to try to look at it as more of a nuanced way of talking about controversial issues. So what you'll see, rather than a sort of people on the right, people on the left conversation here tonight, instead what you'll see is a really nuanced discussion by really, really smart thinkers who are experts in their field about controversial issues. So I hope that is what you came to see, because that's absolutely what you're going to get. In the meantime, I also want to just make sure that I draw your attention to the different things that we have to offer and how it is that you can help to come support us. So first of all, do you want to? So you can find us on our, what's the first thing, social media?
Yes.
You can find us on our social media at UA Debate Series. So you can follow us on our UA Debate Series on Instagram and on Facebook and on Twitter. It would be great if you could give us a like or a follow. That's a great way to find out where we're going to do and how we're going to do future events. Speaking of future events, our next event is going to be on October 27th at 4 p.m. And it's going to be on voting rights. And we're going to ask the question, should voting rights be extended to everyone, to all citizens? And Santa Clara University is actually going to come here with their students to talk to our students about that for a really great discourse. So hopefully you guys can come to that. But please give us a follow. And if you want to go to our website, it'll be at sbs.arizona.edu /UA-debate-series. And if you really love us, you can click the donate button and give us some money, because that would be wonderful. In the meantime, we have 4 wonderful speakers and a very, very wonderful moderator who has agreed to take my place because I am terrible at it. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for the night, which is Janine Relly. Janine Relly is an associate professor at the School of Journalism with a courtesy appointment with the School of Government and Public Policy. She is an affiliated faculty member of the Center of Latin American Studies, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and Center for Border and Global Journalism. Her research focuses on access to public information and freedom of expression in countries with developing economies, transitioning political systems, and the post-conflict environments. Her most recent work examines social movements activity around the Right to Information Act in India. Dr. Relly also has done research that has looked at historically at business influences on the U.S. Freedom Information Act. Thank you for putting up with that. I'm wearing my contact lenses, and it's terribly hard for me to read things. So that said, please give a hand for Dr. Relly, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So welcome to the Free Speech Debate Series. Good evening, everyone. This evening we have a great panel to address some fundamental questions that we're all asking or thinking about. We'll ask our panel participants about the environment for information access with public records. We'll look at whether the government has the right to keep information from the press and the public in the interest of national security, and many other things, and we hope you'll pitch in toward the end. But before we start, I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel, and I'll do this alphabetically. Mr. Christopher Conover covers politics and the military for Arizona Public Media. He holds a bachelor's degree from Florida State University and has nearly 30 years of experience covering the Florida and Arizona legislatures for both television and radio. Before moving to Tucson, he worked for WFSU-TV, the Florida channel, and he anchored a weekly news magazine and provided legislative coverage for television and radio. And he also produced half-hour documentaries. Mr. Conover was news director at Florida Public Radio Network during the election of 2000 recount. He has also done a few things some of us likely have not, such as flying through the eye of a hurricane, piloting an F-16, if you can imagine that, and wading hip deep through the Everglades, all to get a story. Mr. Conover has won numerous journalism awards for his work, including a National Edward R. Murrow Award, a National Society of Professional Journalists Award, and then numerous regional Edward R. Murrow Awards and awards from the Society of Professional Journalists at the regional level, and others, including from the Associated Press. So thank you so much for being with us. Dr. David Coulier is an associate professor and former director of the School of Journalism, where he teaches public affairs reporting, media ethics, law, and access to government information. Dr. Coulier was a newspaper reporter and editor in the Pacific Northwest before entering academia. And he is the co-author of The Art of Access, Strategies for Acquiring Public Records and Transparency 2.0, Digital Data and Privacy in a Wired World. As a former national president and Freedom of Information chair for the Society of Professional Journalists, Professor Coulier advocated for a federal shield law to protect journalists from being jailed for refusing to reveal their sources or notes. He has also testified numerous times before Congress regarding improvements to the Freedom of Information Act. He is currently on sabbatical, producing a second edition of The Art of Access and writing another book on freedom of information advocacy in the 21st century. Thank you so much, Professor Coulier, for being here. Dr. Volodymyr Lysenko, who received his doctorate from the University of Washington in information science, has published research in peer-reviewed journals on the use of information and communication technologies for socio-political transformations, particularly in the former USSR countries. He conducted research as a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford in the UK and Columbia University here in the US. Previously, he served as an expert for the Directorate General of Education and Culture of the European Commission, and he was also a member of the Council of the European Association of Science Editors. Currently, his research focuses on information access, media freedom, disinformation campaigns, information war, and related disruptions to democratic processes around the globe. At the University of Arizona, Dr. Lysenko teaches courses on information security and ethics in a digital world in the School of Information. And then Ms. Nancy Montoya is a broadcast Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who works at Arizona Public Media now. She has experience in 4 major media markets, and she's an Arizona native and has worked as a reporter in addition to other markets at KVOA here, KGUN, and KOLD, and 5 other TV newsrooms in major U.S. cities. Her area of expertise is immigration and U.S.-Mexico border issues. Ms. Montoya pioneered a Latin American news bureau that included 15 other TV newsrooms from around the country. Her reporting on the death squads in El Salvador and Nicaragua garnered her the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Silver Baton Award. Ms. Montoya has won 6 Emmys, a Peabody, and several other international broadcast awards for her reporting. She co-owns Media Source America, which produces independent documentary projects. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Great. So, we're going to cover a couple different subjects. But first, since we have experts on this panel who have either used or lobbied around or focused upon public records laws, or we'll start with public records laws. We can't pass up this opportunity. So we know that 50 states, U.S. states, have different public records laws, and the federal law is the Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1966 and amended numerous times thereafter. You all likely have worked with state, national, or other countries' public records laws, those of you on the panel. What is your overall impression in recent years from your use of these laws or knowledge of them and about their effectiveness?
Well, everybody looked at me, so I guess I better talk.
Ladies first.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're being very generous. I think public records laws here in the States are the best in the world. I've tried to access records in places like the former Soviet Union, Russia, all over Eastern Europe, all over Central America, Mexico, and it's virtually non-existent in many of those countries. And while I love to bitch and moan about our FOIA laws here, Freedom of Information, I really am appreciative as a journalist that I have access to those things. Sometimes they can be burdenous. They really require a lot of information from a journalist. But I think overall, they're the best in the world. And I know, Christopher, you've done a lot with, much more with FOIAs than I do.
In the last couple of years especially, we have bumped up at Arizona Public Media our use of FOIAs. And I've spent a lot of time with Dave calling up saying, okay, I can't get this. Where do I go? What do I do? At times, to give you an example, there was a online generator of Make America Great hats, and you could change what it says. I changed mine to say, Make America Answer FOIAs Again. Getting FOIAs can be difficult, or any public records. You have to know what you're asking for, and you have to know what your rights are as a member of the public, as a journalist. The laws vary from state to state. When I was a government reporter in Florida, conveniently, their open records laws are very liberal in a good way for journalists, and they're constitutional in Florida, which is great. It's a little higher standard than the law. Here in Arizona, they're not quite as easy to get, and when you're dealing with the military, which I deal with a lot, getting information is very difficult. They will always make the argument of national security. Sometimes it's a legit argument, but for example, I asked the military regarding Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. One of their A-10 fighter plane units came back and had participated in the Battle of Mosul, and all the pilots were talking about that it was the largest battle they had ever taken part in, and one of the largest air battles in recent time. Okay, well, largest is an interesting term, so I requested, how many rounds did you fire? How many bombs did you drop as a unit from Davis-Monthan? I am still waiting on that answer. 18 months since I put in the request, I think it is now, because the military says that is of national security. But we did it 18 months ago. Everybody knows the outcome, but it is still a matter of national security. So sometimes you get the information you want, sometimes you don't. We were talking up here, a couple of us, doing FOIAs where I've had to protect sources, which is a whole nother area that I'm sure we'll get into tonight. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's not. And Dave has, you know, as Jean said, written some great books and advises a lot of us when we call him up and say, how can I do this? What's a good way around? And he's got some great strategies that I've used successfully. and some great strategies that I've been unsuccessful with, but they were good strategies nonetheless. We gave it the try. So there are lots of things we can talk about with healthcare and the military as we go on. That was the last one I talked with you about, was HIPAA laws, which we'll get into, I'm sure.
Professor Collier, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I'd just say there are a couple of ways of looking at it. First, you can look at the text of the laws. And if you look at the text of the laws, ours actually really aren't that great. In fact, there's an outfit that ranks all the nations. There's 128 nations now that have FOIA laws. And they rate them, and they rate them by a variety of things. They give them points. And last week, they had a new winner, a country that just adopted a FOIA law that is by far the best in the world. It's the strongest on paper. Any guesses what country this would be? Take
Russia.
a wild guess. Russia? No.
What part of the world?
South
On the
Asia,
round part.
Central
The
Asia.
Shout them out. Whoever gets it,
You under it?
I'll give $20 to.
I was gonna say, I'll throw in a Reese's peanut butter.
I'll just tell you, Afghanistan. Afghanistan now has the strongest FOIA law in the world, bumping out the previous top-ranked country. Any guesses there? Mexico. Mexico, for a long time, had the best FOIA law in the world, on paper.
On paper.
So then you look at implementation, how well it works on the ground. The United States FOIA law is now ranked 69th in the world. A bunch of other countries have a better law than ours. But, how agencies respond to citizens differs. And that's harder to get at. And they're trying to figure out a way to measure that, and it's not easy. I hear different things. I've heard journalists say there are other countries where it's actually a lot better to get information on the ground than here for a variety of reasons. And of course, throughout the country, it's all over the map. It's hit and miss. But the bottom line is, in our country, it's getting worse. It's been slow, incremental decay in our ability as citizens to see what our government's up to I'd say over the past 30 years in particular. In fact, the percentage of FOIA requests that end up in nothing, and you getting nada or all blacked out stuff, has gradually crept up. It's now up to 78%. So nearly 4 out of 5 times when you ask the government for information, you're told to go pound sand. You're told to go away.
Or you're not told anything
Or
at all.
you're right.
More
And in the
likely.
past year, the prevalence of federal agencies saying, we looked, we didn't find anything that, would meet your request. Sorry. It went up 18% in 1 year,
Wow.
in the past year. So something's going on
But
in
don't
our
you think
country.
it has to do with the various agencies that you work with? I work with immigration and I work with, like, the Border Patrol a lot. Those two have been very good in sending me things that I request. Not 100%, but I don't work with multiple agencies, so I'm wondering if it does depend on what agencies you work
Well,
for.
and those agencies are actually the worst.
I guess
and
I
so-
sweet talk them because I get a lot of stuff out of them.
Exactly, and that's what we find, is that there's a lot of discretion, it's very arbitrary in the system. And so those who, are pretty good at schmoozing and getting to know FOIA officers and employees within agencies are gonna have a higher success rate, as opposed to someone coming in blank or just submitting a letter requesting something. So there are a lot of variables, and it really depends. But the bottom line is, there's a reason why we have these laws. There's a reason why it's in a lot of constitutions, and a lot of nations in this country consider it a fundamental human right, like the right not to be tortured, the right to have clean water and air. Because without information about what our government's doing, we're in a tough spot as citizens. Then the government can pretty much do whatever it wants, and we start sinking into a society like, East Germany and Russia and Iraq, with and all these kinds of despots and regimes that we don't want to be like that. And the only way we're going to prevent that is if we're able to know what our government's up to so we can hold it accountable.
Yeah, speaking of Russia, actually,
All right, it keeps coming up.
I am an expert in Russian information security. I can tell you that if you do similar request to Russian government about the governmental affairs that they don't want to share, you can be at least prosecuted by the Russian special forces, security forces, and I know many Russian journalists who were forced to immigrate from Russia to countries like United Kingdom or even bordering Ukraine, just because they were persecuted by Russian authorities. So here we have very good FOIA Act. It works nice, and in comparison to non-democratic countries, everything is good.
Very good. Thank you so much for weighing in on that.
Well, it's true. I've never been jailed for putting in a FOIA request. So.
It's a good life. So I want to give the panel an opportunity if you want to make an opening statement. I kind of jumped, but feel free not to, but I know a couple of you. Do you want to make
Yeah, sure. So, of course, we know that information, free speech and freedom of press are protected by the First Amendment, but it's not absolute. So it can be restricted for the betterment for society, for the human, for the betterment of our people, for public good. And let's again take example from my area, Russian information security, Russian information law, Russian information groups. We know that we have a TV channel called RT, which means Russia Today, and it broadcasts 24/7 on our cable channels. You just get subscription, for example, on Comcast TV, and you don't want to have that channel, but it's already included in the package. So sometimes you can stumble upon it just while going browsing through channels, and it's just pure propaganda. It's not information, it's information weapon, what Russia is doing against our democracy. And we know that at least thousands of Americans, if not millions, sometimes watch this TV channel. And we know, for example, how Russia was meddling into our elections, and that the result of the elections was decided in 3 states by just tens of thousands of voters. I wonder how many of those were watching, for example, Russia Today, or, for example, were subject of Russian influence operations on online social media like Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, and we know that they had huge information operations. I just published a paper in May about Russian cyber troops. You can find them online at the open access journal called First Monday, and huge information operations by Russia. So I believe that such propagandistic weapons like Russia Today, they should not be covered by the First Amendment, and sanctions against Russia for meddling into our elections should be also spread to such information weapons as Russia Today. And for example, we have just the most recent example, yesterday's announcement by Department of Justice when they uncovered 7 Russian hackers belonging to GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, and they were trying to hack into our, for example, critical infrastructures like Westinghouse, which is a company which builds atomic plants and other structures, and then after hacking they publish those hacked materials online on websites pretending to be a hacking group called Fancy Bear, and FBI actually put down those websites. So again, it was not abusing of First Amendment because it was not information outlets, it was just information weapons. So again, freedom of information is not absolute, and for the betterment of society, there should be exclusions aimed at fighting information warfare which is conducted against us, for example, by Russia.
Great, absolutely fabulous. points, and maybe we can get weigh-ins on that, but did you all?
I'm sorry, I don't think the mic is actually working that well, but we luckily have acoustic tiles, so if we we can hear you guys great.
You
Great.
can hear.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is-
We'll ignore the mics
Okay,
now.
okay.
No mics.
So does anyone else want to make or should we just keep
Yeah,
going?
let's go
Okay,
on the
okay.
topics.
So any comments on, follow-up on that, or?
I am intrigued by some of your work. I would definitely get online to look at it. We have a good friend who has retired as the bureau chief, I guess he was, you would call it, of the CIA in Moscow was his latest posting. And he's now a contributor for CNN, Steve Hall. And he has taught me so much about cybersecurity and the things that we take for granted in this country. We shouldn't do that anymore. We shouldn't just assume that all of our contacts are confidential, that everything that we use on our computer somehow is protected. It's not. And so I'm anxious to read some of your work, because I think the Russian government, above all, are the culprits in this area.
Thank you. Anybody else, or?
No, I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
It is.
You know, Russian today, I'm one of those academic tools of theirs. I was interviewed twice by them.
Yeah.
And
Be very cautious.
oh yeah, no, and I knew they're a propaganda tool for Russia. What makes them different from other propaganda tools we have in our country are they're basically government driven, right? I mean, would you say that they're an arm of the government, Russian government?
Absolutely. It's
Right.
funded by Russian government. They have budget like hundreds of millions of dollars per year.
So then you have some outlets in our country that some say are propaganda. I won't name names.
Fox.
Oh, okay. Nancy nailed it. Fox, which is a propaganda tool for an ideology, but it's not funded by the government. It just so happens to be pushing a certain agenda. And of course, some people would argue that other media outlets are pushing other agendas, right? And and would you say that those outlets should deserve First Amendment protection? That the line is whether it's a government arm or not?
No, of course, our mass media majority, they of course deserve First Amendment protection because they independent, they serving to just provide checks against other three main branches of government: legislative, judicial, and executive branches. So we have this fourth branch, mass media, which is supposed to be checked against those three branches if they have any problems with anything during this people. So those, of course, they respect, that they deserve all protection, 100%. But Russia today is not an information outlet, it's an information weapon, it's propaganda, it's 100% propaganda.
But we do see it here. I worked for a group that was solely funded by the government of the state of Florida. And when I went in to work for them, they said, oh yeah, we have a huge firewall, you can do whatever you want. Until the executive producer came in and said, you may not ask at gubernatorial news conferences questions that are off topic. And I thought, well, I don't get to see the governor very often. I may have a lot of questions to ask him. I don't care about the ribbon cutting that we're doing at the moment. And I left within about 3 months because that executive producer was afraid of losing funding. And a number of us left. I was the first one. I was not the last to leave for that reason. So it was state-run television, and I left very quickly once we got that mandate. So it does happen here, and it's very subtle.
The line is being blurred, though,
Yeah.
between news and commentary, which I personally, it really offends me and it scares me. We have commentators who are coming off as journalists, and for example, on MSNBC, you have Lawrence O'Donnell, he is a commentator, Yet the other night, when they did a wrap-up on the Supreme Court nomination, they pulled in all their reporters, and Lawrence O'Donnell was the moderator of all of this. And same thing with Fox News. You know, there's commentators and then there's journalists. And I think the average public, maybe you folks know the difference. I think a lot of people do not know the difference between what is a commentary and what is journalism. And that frightens me.
And I teach, some of you in the room know this, I teach in the journalism school also, and some of you have been in my class, and you've heard me ask early in the class, who here is registered to vote? Get a handful of people to raise their hands. Okay, who's a Republican, who's a Democrat? I said, that's the last time as a journalist you may ever answer that question. It's not your job to be a Republican or a Democrat. If you cover government, as I do, and have for 30 years now, I guarantee you I have covered governors, US senators, presidents who I didn't agree with politically. It's not my job. It is my job to ask them questions and to pin them down on things and to honestly report what they said, which is really hard to do when you vehemently disagree with someone. But it's not my job to vehemently disagree. We have other people who write columns and opinion pieces. That's their job. But it's hard to do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just before we're leaving the RT conversation right now, but I do think that I haven't quite seen any, reporting on the U.S. government like RT. It's a really interesting perspective to behold. So it's worth looking at, I think, for sure. So we're going to leave cybersecurity for a few minutes and information warfare and public records, and we're going to move on to SHIELD laws that protect journalists from having to reveal confidential sources, for one. So from your work in recent years, what are some of the reasons that you think that the U.S. Congress hasn't adopted federal SHIELD law?
Do you want the cynical answer, or
No,
would you
sure.
like? I think it has a lot to do with if I find something out through good old reporting, or somebody tells me something, and it's something, shall we say, less than flattering to the government, regardless of which party is in charge, that party is not going to be pleased, and that party would like to know where I got my information. And it behooves them as a party, as a government, to figure that out. Again, that's not my problem in the sense of, their PR. So I think that's why they have not put up those SHIELD laws. It behooves them from a staying in power standpoint to find out all the information they can. I've used, and in broadcast we use confidential sources a lot less. It's harder for us because Nancy and I, we have to have sound bites. We have to have tape. So it's a little bit harder. I did one a couple of years ago here in town. We used someone who was more or less a whistleblower on the Border Patrol, was not a Border Patrol employee. And this person gave us amazing information. We went out and this person gave us paper, the paper trails and everything that we then went and had to verify. Because just because somebody gives it to us, it's like, well, all right, let me see if it's actually legit. We have to fact check it and back check it and all of that, and it turned out it was. And when it came time to do the interview with this person, they didn't want to do it. They were afraid for their job and for their safety because they worked very closely with the Border Patrol while not being a Border Patrol employee in a small town. And they were afraid. So we promised them we would disguise them, we would protect them as best we could. To do that, I had to go to my boss, which was about 3 or 4 bosses ago now, and convince that boss that this person needed to be protected. I happened to run across the other day some of the materials from that story. That story is about 5 or 6 years old now, and it was on one of the servers at the office. And all it says, if Nancy ever finds it, is X info. Nowhere in that, because somebody else in the newsroom could see it, is the person's name or any identifying information. When we did shoot a TV interview with this person, we created a silhouette on the wall, shot the silhouette, put the person in a hat to change the silhouette and change their voice. 4 people know the identity of this person. My boss was not one of them.
Yeah.
It was myself, another reporter, the other reporter I was working with, an intern, and that other reporter's wife, who also happened to be a reporter. A little hard to hide it from her. Other than that, nobody knew that person's name. We, in the newsroom, did not refer to the person by their name ever. We made up a name. It happened to be George. And anytime we referred to the person, we referred to them as George. To this day, you cannot find a single piece of paper, and we were talking about it beforehand. Well, what about if Border Patrol had tried to come after us to get emails and things like that? We didn't use emails. We used the phone. You know, we protected this person as much as we could. When the story came out, the Border Patrol was not pleased, to say the least. They thought they figured out who it was, and they did everything they could to make this person lose their job. But this person couldn't lose their job because there was no proof.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
we worked really, really hard on it, but for broadcast, it's harder. In print, I can say a person will call Dr. Riley, or Dr. Relly said, comma, quote. That may not be his or her name. In broadcast, I got to have a soundbite, so it's a little harder to work with, but we do it.
I find that I'm starting to look more into shield laws to protect me because I do immigration. And so I'm interviewing a lot of people who are not here with proper documentation. And so when I do an interview and the person does not want to be identified, there's a lot I have to go through to protect them, but at the same time to make sure that it's ethical. So in my case, just my news director has to know the name of that person and be able to know that that person is real, that I'm not just making that person up. And pretty recently, I'm following right now a Honduran woman, a transgender Honduran woman. I followed her all the way from Honduras to the Nogales port of entry, where she applied for asylum, and she has now been sitting at the Cibola Detention Center in New Mexico for the past 6 months. And while there, she was raped, she was abused, she got to a telephone, was able to call me and tell me. I did a story about it right away, and boy, was I attacked by ICE, by immigration. They all wanted to know, who is this woman? We want to go help her. I was about to reveal that. But they threatened legal action, that I would tell them who she was or else. Little did they know that I've done many stories with her, but have, hidden her name and disguised her. And so it's now getting to a point where you really have to protect yourself.
Well, and to protect the person, because while Nancy is far and away our prime immigration and border reporter, I've come in, I back, when I say I back her up, I'm like 3rd string, even though there's nobody really between us, or maybe even 4th string behind Nancy. And I've run into this, especially when DACA was going on, coming across students on this campus who were DACA recipients who did not want that widely known. Even though they had a level of status, They didn't want their professors to know. They didn't want their friends to know that they hadn't told. So we have to have discussions. If we want to do this, we go to our boss, and luckily she's very reasonable and wonderful about it, but we have to justify to her why we are not revealing who this person is. And there has to be a good reason. Legal status issues like Nancy is dealing with, because they are afraid for any number of reasons, is generally a reason that is acceptable in our newsroom. Sometimes I've gone to her and said, I want to do something, and she said, can you find it another way? So that we don't have to use this person. Can they point you down a road that will have, the pot of gold at the end of it? It is not something a decision we take lightly. And actually, I was talking with my mom about this, who's my biggest fan, because everybody's mom is always their biggest fan. No matter how old you are, your mom will always be your biggest fan. And she said, it really takes a lot of trust on the part of my viewer, my listener, if I'm doing things for the web, my reader. They have to trust me that I have vetted this person and they are legitimately who they say they are, to have that information. And maybe I'm not giving their name, but my mom, it was such a great perspective. If you trust the reporter that you're reading, listening to, watching, then it's easier to digest the anonymous source, because they have done their homework to vet the person.
I'd like to ask Dave.
Yeah, I was just going to
Yeah.
say, Professor Coyer, you have done work on the federal shield law. Can you talk a little bit about why we don't have one?
Well, yeah, and it might help just to give a quick overview for
Yes,
folks.
please.
Every year, about 7,000 journalists in this country face a subpoena. They're served. I've been served twice, and you
I've been served.
served, yeah. So they go to your newsroom and they call you up, and you've been served. And it's someone who wants to get your notes or the identity of a source that you had that may have been unnamed or anonymous in the story, like these two great examples you talked about. And if you don't cough up the information or give your notebooks over, then a judge can hold you in contempt of court and throw you in jail. And there have been a lot of journalists who said, I'm going to protect my source, I'm going to protect my notes, because if I don't, no one will trust me, no one will talk to me again. People will think I'm just a tool of the police. And so I have to hold my promises. And actually there's a Supreme Court case that says if you're a reporter and you break your promise with a source, you can be held liable. So you're required by law to keep your promise with your source, but you're also required by law to do what the court wants you to do and give up your information. So typically, they'll try to quash a subpoena. They'll go to the court and they'll try to say, look, you don't really need this information to do what you need to do to litigate your case. And this information, really, you could get it elsewhere. So there's no need to force a reporter to do that. And most of the time, the judge agrees and it goes away. Sometimes not. The record holder is Josh Wolf from California, 226 days in jail. That he stuck to his guns. So this is a problem. Now, at the state local level, it's not a big problem, because most states have either statutory shield laws or it's been kind of codified through the courts, case law. There are a few states that don't have protection, but we have no protection at the federal level. And guess what? Who uses unnamed sources the most in this country? It's everyone covering the federal government in Washington, D.C. It's those big name newspapers and TV stations that are always using unnamed sources in the White House or what have you. And that information also has the most at stake. National security. So it's really a balancing test. And that's where the Supreme Court has laid down a balancing test to decide when it's appropriate to force a journalist to do this and when it isn't. So that's where we're at today. We have basically, it's up to a judge and how persuasive a lawyer can be. Because you know, there's some cases where maybe a journalist should cough up that information. Maybe it would be in the best interest of the nation. But most of the times it isn't. So we've been fighting journalists for, a good 10, 15 years now to try to get a federal shield law in place, and we almost did it. We had a good shot around 2005, and then some senator put a hold on the bill, and a secret hold. Did you know senators could like squish a bill secretly? And it's an interesting procedural thing. And so you don't know who killed it. Well, we rallied through Society of Professional Journalists, all the journalists in all the states to contact their U.S. senators to ask them, are you the secret senator? And then we had a map online, and we filled in the states. And we all started filling in, no. And there was one state left, Arizona.
Oh my.
And it turned out it was John Kyle, who was a U.S. senator from Arizona.
And is again.
And is again now.
At least temporarily.
Temporarily. So John Kyle, he did not care for this idea at all. And I think for his good reasons on his side, he believes in national security, and he doesn't trust some bad journalists getting information and spreading it out that'll hurt our national interests. I get that, makes sense, and we couldn't convince him otherwise. So this kind of bubbled along for some years. We were close to getting a shield law passed around 2012, I think it was, give or take. And we were almost there. And then WikiLeaks dumped a whole bunch of documents online. And our members of Congress got cold feet and said, no, we can't have, it's too easy. And then we almost got it the next year. And then to answer your initial question, I can tell you what killed the shield. It was the Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice basically went behind our backs and talked to the members in the Senate to kill it, because we've had a lot of disagreements over the years, journalists in the Department of Justice.
Who oversee the FOIA?
So it's they're not very, they don't agree with us, which is fine. And there's been a shield law bill introduced this session. We predict it won't go anywhere, but it's good that it's coming up again. If the Democrats get control of the House or Senate, then we could see movement on improving FOIA and improving this, mainly because historically we see the most movement when the president and the Congress are two different parties. That's where we see the most advances, because Congress wants to hold the president accountable when they're in the opposing party. Just like we had huge success in 2016 when the Republicans were running the show in Congress and there's a Democratic president. We got the FOIA Improvement Act of 2016 passed that made some pretty good improvements to FOIA. We only got that because of that friction between Congress and the executive. So right now there's no friction. Well, it's a different kind of friction right now between Congress and the president. So if it changes, maybe we'll see movement in the next several years.
Thank you.
I also would like to add an example on how it's important to protect your sources from Russian experience. So, as you know, in spring, Russian secret services were trying to poison their former agent who was residing in United Kingdom in the city of Salisbury, and they sent at least 2 killers to just apply some chemical agent so he would die. And eventually British authorities were able to identify those 2 people and their fictitious names, because they entered United Kingdom with falsified passports. And several Russian journalists, oppositional journalists, were participating in activities to uncover their real names. And one of those journalists had eventually he uncovered one of those names, but problems was that one of his sources was former employee of Russian security services, retiree, and probably that journalist was already under surveillance of Russian security services, so through his contacts, probably they hacked into his contacts and they got to that his source and interrogated him, and the next victim would be that journalist, because through interrogations they found lots of information against that oppositional journalist. So fortunately the journalist was prepared for such activities and he escaped to one of the Baltic states bordering with Russia, and currently he's safe, but if he would not take such precautions, it would be very bad for him, and would be very bad end for him. So it's very important to protect your sources and not to allow, if, for example, if you are under surveillance by non-democratic authorities like in Russia, you should always take care about your sources, not to disclose even unintentionally their real names, for example, like in this case.
Thank you. I'm going to try to run through a couple of questions and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. I think they wanted to give you all plenty of time. So continuing our discussion about anonymous sources and what scenarios the law or policy should, national security should trump the need to protect anonymous sources. Maybe we could start on this end and go that way. Yeah.
So absolutely.
Maybe some examples. Yeah.
So as I already said, this was the first example from Russia, and
Sure.
it's very important because if you don't protect your sources, you can endanger not only your sources but also yourself, as I already said. And actually, this was the happy ending, but we know that bad ending for Russian journalists. Several of them were killed. For example, Anna Politkovskaya, who was killed because she was investigating various Russian atrocities during war against Chechen Republic, and she was eventually killed in 2006. Or, for example, Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed the same year, again in London. Again, he was killed by polonium, and probably his contacts led eventually to his destiny, because he was unable to protect his contacts, and those contacts were in Russia. They were interrogated by Russian authorities, and eventually all those contacts led to him. He was exposed, and Russia just sent its agents to London and killed him.
Any other?
Sometimes protecting somebody comes out of the blue. I was doing a very deep investigative story 2 weekends ago in Cochise County on hummingbird banding. Big investigative story. It was a feature, and there were a lot of volunteers involved. And I had one of the volunteers come walking up to me. We were shooting a TV story, and she pulled me aside and said, "I need to talk to you." I thought, oh great, what have I done? I've been here like 5 minutes. What have I done? And she said, "I'm an undercover narcotics officer. I would really appreciate it if you did not show my face." Like, okay, I can work with that. Legitimate reason. She's an undercover narcotics officer. She didn't want necessarily people to know where she spends some of her free time volunteering, with this program. That is not a great national security thing necessarily but it was a personal security for her, and there was no reason to not honor her request. So it is a balancing act that we have to deal with from time to time. So I assured her that we would do everything we could to keep her out of our video, and if by chance she ended up in the back of a shot, we would not use the shot. No big deal, but you have to weigh so many things when you're going to protect somebody.
When you're talking about,
this was one of those cases. It was pretty easy, but other times it's not that easy.
when you're talking about weighing things, in the early 80s, that's 19, not 1880s, okay? not that
She was
old.
there in the 1880s.
I was. But there was a big strike in the Clifton Morenci area, a copper strike. And a source came up to me. There had been dynamite that was stolen from the company. It was big friction between the strikers and the company, and big battles, and the Arizona National Guard was called in, and very, very dangerous situation. And dynamite was stolen. And one of the strikers, who, I'm from that area, so they came up to me and they said, hey, I know where the dynamite is. And we know what's going to happen. And they said, but you know, you can't use this information. I went back and I'm thinking, dynamite, people killed. I'm not protecting this source. And I had to make an ethical judgment there that, and I went to DPS, Department of Public Safety, and I went to them because in my mind, it wasn't worth protecting the source if people were going to die. And so I did. I went in and I didn't turn in that person, but I turned in the information. So that was where you have to weigh, is your journalistic standards worth somebody's life? To me, they weren't.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to you all, I'm going to skip down to our last question here. So in your opinions, do whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden and news outlets that published stories out of his material represent the most important role of an impartial press, if you will, or a threat to national security? This is just the kind of question that...
Actually, I don't think that Snowden is a whistleblower. Even if we consider formal definitions of whistleblower, there are 5 criteria. 2 of them, if he tried first to talk to his manager, second, if he tried other contacts within his organization. Nothing of that was done, so he is not a whistleblower. He is just a traitor who defected to our adversary, to Russia, and disclosed all information which actually helped terrorists to avoid persecution by our authorities, because he disclosed some information that terrorists stopped using, for example, satellite phones and some other stuff which we were able to intercept.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'd have to respectfully disagree. I mean, I understand your points, but I mean, I think he's a hero. And I know a lot of people think he's a traitor. He did attempt to go to his superiors. He saw other of his peers who tried to go through the process and were ignored and shunted and their careers ruined. And so he saw how our system works. You would hope that our whistleblower system would work in our federal government. A lot of people assume that it does, but it really doesn't. And so he felt he had this important information. The American public should know that our government is spying on us and collecting all this information, right? Now, it's hard for them to sift through all that information that they're collecting, but the bottom line is they were collecting all this information about us. And, that's not something that a lot of people appreciate in our country. We don't want the government spying on us. And so he felt he had no choice but to hand the information over to some journalists and hope they could get the word out, and that's what happened. And he knew what he was doing. He had to flee the country because our government did not want that to happen. And we have a lot of examples of this where we need people in government that know something bad's going on to be able to have an outlet to get that out there. I don't think WikiLeaks is the best way to do that. I think going to a journalist who hopefully will vet it is better than nothing, as well as there are other avenues we have in our government for that stuff to get out. But those avenues are not good enough. We need an independent press that these people could turn to occasionally to hold our government accountable when bad things are happening. Jim Risen's a great example. New York Times reporter. He wrote a book called State of War. Some key unnamed anonymous sources that gave him very important information that told us a lot of bad things that our government did by going into Iraq. Not to mention millions and millions of dollars wasted and all sorts of other things. The government did not like that, and they subpoenaed his sources, and it was a 7-year battle, and he lost. He lost. The court said, nah, we feel you have to give it up. And so if you don't, you're going to go to prison. And he would have, except the Attorney General backed off at the last minute and just said, nah, we don't want to throw a journalist in prison. It's
a bad look.
Going to get some blowback. So he never went to prison, and right now he's working for First Look Media, The Intercept, writing about all the bad stuff that's going on in our government. And we need that. But like Nancy says, it has to be done responsibly. It has to be done thinking through things, vetting information, verifying it, acting ethically as best we can. And so far, I think that's worked fairly well overall.
And I think you've really hit on something, is there's a responsibility on the journalists. Yeah. Unfortunately, Edward Snowden did not call me and give me the documents. But if he had, I would not have been on the air the next morning with them. A responsible journalist now has to take all that information and vet it and make sure that it's legit. And that takes time and effort and energy. And it's, on top of that, it's hard to vet stuff like that. But again, it goes back to what I was talking about with trust. When I go on the air, I have to maintain a level of trust with my audience that what I'm saying is true, to the best of my ability to prove that it's true. So when you get whistleblowers and things like that, as we did with this Border Patrol story, we spent a long time back-checking the information this person gave to us and going around to make sure it was legit before we went after the Border Patrol. I took it as a triumph that they didn't talk to me for 6 months, they being the Border Patrol. Afterwards, I was like, ooh, I won. They won't talk to me for a while. But you gotta vet it. And the minute a journalist goes out and exposes some grand wrong that turns out to be untrue because they didn't do their homework, it doesn't matter how many anonymous good sources you have or how many on the record good sources you have, you're done, and that journalist won't be trusted. So even with the anonymous sources, I think you almost have to vet them harder because they are anonymous and there's a legitimate reason to keep them anonymous, but you have to maintain that public trust at the same time. So you better be right.
Thank you. Any other comments on that front?
I don't know about any Snowden attempts to talk with his managers or supervisors about it. I'm not sure that he actually attempted anything of that. Second, about WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is used for a long time by Russian security services as a front to just dump all this material that they have. For example, when they hacked DNC in 2016, they just provided all the information to WikiLeaks. So again, it's outlet which is used by the enemy to discredit our democracy. So using WikiLeaks as a outlet for your even some legitimate information, I think it's not a good idea.
So are there some questions in the audience? I'm sure. Please, and I don't know if the mic, is the mic working or?
Do we know if
I think
Oh, perfect.
Can
yeah.
anyone,
Okay.
everyone hear me?
Thank you.
All right, solid. So in the past few months, we've seen, like in Miramar, for example, we've seen like Reuters journalists jailed because of reporting they do. And since the 2016 presidential election, there's been a lot of like controversy regarding like the state of free press. Is it like actual like true news, or is it all fake news? Is there some sort of concern that we as like American citizens, whether you're a Republican or Democrat or just independent, is there concern that that we're potentially heading towards like a state in U.S. history in which we may start seeing like journalists jailed more often because of them doing types of reporting?
I don't know that we're heading to an area where journalists will be arrested and jailed, but I can tell you this. If I cover a Trump event, which I have done many, many times, I am seeing a trend now. Probably right after the election, I was attacked, I was spit on, I was pushed, and I was called the fake news. I'm going, I'm public media, I'm NPR, I'm PBS. How am I the fake news? But they didn't care. It was a camera, it was a journalist, and we were fake news. So I am seeing more hostility out there, covering any one of the rallies, things like that. You have to be really careful. I'm an old lady, so I don't get bothered that much, but this guy gets bothered probably more than I do. But it's dangerous out there. I've never said that before. I've covered civil wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador. I've covered things where I was afraid. I'm afraid now in my own country. I take more precautions now than I ever have.
I've also covered Trump rallies in the last couple of years. I've covered Klan rallies when I worked in the South. And so I've covered my share of, shall we say, hostile environments. I guess it was last August, I was in Phoenix for the Trump event, and I was outside. We had a crew inside covering the speech and everything. I was outside. I broke a personal record that night. I got tear gassed 3 times, which was a new record for me. Usually it would only be like once in an event. We got hit 3 times, and this was not long after Charlottesville, and we had discussions in almost 3 decades I'd been doing this job that I had never had in a newsroom before, and I've covered my share of rallies where I knew 2 sides. I've covered abortion rallies with thousands of people literally marching towards each other on both sides. It's like, oh, this could get a little exciting. We never had discussions about safety. We had very deep discussions in our newsroom before we headed out for that about safety. We used Google Maps in advance to figure out where the rally was going and various escape points and rally points if we got separated and all kinds of things like that. I've never had those discussions. And like I said, I've covered Klan rallies, I've covered pro and anti-abortion or choice rallies and all kinds of things like that. And never have we had to have those types of discussions. And those discussions are something we have in our newsroom now. I won't say on a regular basis, but they're discussions that we have. And it's different. It's very different.
Well, and to answer your question, journalists are being arrested, and in greater numbers every year. You can go to a website called Press Freedom Tracker. Press Freedom Tracker is created by the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they try to track this stuff. And so I think so far this year is up to around 36, 39 journalists that have been arrested. Now most of those are photographers who are covering protests, and they get herded into the paddy wagons with everyone else. So that's really not for their content, but there are incidences of journalists being thrown in prison and jail for criticizing the government. I mean, that's something that they do in Russia, right?
It's awful in Russia.
And,
Actually, to put it...
Right, I was going to say this, let me finish and then go on. I wanted to put in perspective, though, that we have it pretty good here still, and we don't have to worry like they worry in Russia. And if you go to the Committee to Protect Journalists website, all their effort is mainly focused on other parts of the world where hundreds of journalists are killed. And Dr. Relly has done research on this, and we have it much better than folks in the Middle East and Russia, in Central America and Mexico. So as much as I am negative, cynical, downer type, David Downer, and on American government, I do appreciate that I don't live in Russia.
Exactly, I second with you. So in Russia it's awful. So if you just got in jail as a journalist, it's just something you are lucky, because sometimes you just either beaten or sometimes you are killed. And as well as your sources, if sources are identified, also there are two choices. Either you are escaping from the country, or you are under arrest, you are beaten, or you are killed.
I generally know and going to your point, that we've actually got it pretty good. I know that if I ask Governor Ducey a question he doesn't like, it's going to come down to this. He's going to give me a dirty look, he's not going to answer it, and his press person won't return my calls. Okay, I can work with that. You know, it makes my job more difficult, but it does not make my personal life less safe. Though, as Nancy said, we are seeing increase in intensity and propensity to violence and things like that. I will tell you, because I remember when Nancy, when she was spit on it was right after the election, here in Tucson, and the person who came to her rescue was the head of the Pima County Republican Party, who came to Nancy's rescue and said to everybody there, no, she is a reporter. She is here to cover what we are doing. This is wrong. Yeah. So for every escape route and tear gassing and things like that I've dealt with, and shoving and spitting on that Nancy has dealt with, there are bright spots out there still. So it's not terrible. It's not great, but it's not terrible.
And the press tracker was developed, I think, because of this change, the increase in violence. Please.
We appreciate Dr. Lysenko's comments on Eastern Europe and Russia, but anyone reading now sees a record number of journalists murdered in Mexico. The violence in Mexico and the violence to kill in broad daylight publishers of local newspapers, reporters, radio reporters is unprecedented as far as I know. Can we address those issues?
I know a reporter who Nancy and I worked with, Michelle Morisco, who did a lot of work across the border in the early 2000s, had a run-in with a lower-level drug cartel that to this day just makes my skin crawl. He was working on a story, and all of a sudden out in the desert, a couple of trucks rolled up, and they said, hey, we hear you're looking for, and it wasn't El Chapo, but it was some lower level drug cartel person. And Michelle said, yeah. He said, well, he wants to talk to you. And it wasn't one of those friendly, like, hey, he wants to sit down and have a cup of coffee or a beer with you kind of, he wants to talk to you statements. And the darkened windows rolled down, and the guy was in the back seat. And Michelle luckily had a smartphone in his pocket, and he started it recording, so he got tape. But it was a little tense. He wasn't sure initially where this was going, and he was on the other side of the border. He wasn't on our side. So things, little different rules at play here. It happens in Mexico.
And it's as you're saying, and thank you for bringing that up. It's almost a death of a journalist a month killed, and so it's over 120 journalists who've been killed in Mexico in just a decade, and then many disappeared as well. And there have been efforts like strategies to help journalists in Mexico with cyber protection. training, even though that's never perfect. People are being more careful, trying different types of routes. You know, some even using bodyguards, which is not ideal, obviously. Can you imagine going to an interview with a bodyguard
Yeah.
or something like that, right? But I think you have.
But I'm seeing one thing that is working in Mexico. I have a lot of friends who are Mexican reporters. They're doing something called team reporting, where they're going through and handling a big controversial issue. And then the story comes out on multiple platforms, and no names are on it. So the bad guys don't know which reporter actually did what. So it's more of a team effort. And I've seen now many reporters in Mexico are adopting that style so that they don't reveal who they are, but they do reveal the information.
I
Or
spend
move
a
it
lot
to
of
another
time.
organization.
Yeah, I spend time traveling in Mexico because I love going to Mexico, and whenever people stop me that I don't, you know, isn't my friends down there, or the military stops me and they ask, what do you do in the United States? Why, I'm faculty at the University of Arizona.
I don't say I'm a journalist.
Yeah, I never say I'm a journalist.
Well, Dr. Ellie, let me ask you, you're way too modest because you traveled the whole length of the U.S.-Mexico border,
Yeah.
interviewing journalists on both sides and really digging into this. And I'm curious, kind of get at your question. In Russia, the folks bumping off journalists, it's the government, right?
Yeah.
Primarily?
Yeah.
In Mexico, is it the government or is it the cartels or what's the level?
So it's so difficult sometimes
Well, they're the
for
same
journalists
thing.
to
No,
know, right?
sometimes,
So
yeah.
sometimes the government's been co-opted by organized crime groups, so it might be organized crime groups, and to imagine, you know, this is your neighborhood maybe where you grew up. These are your friends that are now part of these organized crime groups. So that's part of the issue. You know, newsrooms, some of them have been infiltrated with organized crime actors, so they're acting as reporters. There's that, and you don't know who you're working with or around. Even some of the most well-known and prominent news organizations have that issue. So it's a very insidious, scary thing, but there's some really brave journalists still doing the work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did you, I don't know,
Yeah,
yeah,
question.
please.
Yeah, so my colleague and I have a question about a topic that's closely related to access of information for the panel, which is net neutrality. And I'd like to frame that in a few different ways. So you've mentioned a few times the value of, say, this page, free press tracker, right, something like that. And you've also mentioned kind of how bad it can get in Russia, right, when folks just disappear. I've taught in countries where those websites would very quickly simply not exist, right? You simply wouldn't be able to get there. Now again, you know, Dr. Lysenko talking about something like Russia Today, that's total propaganda, right? And then you mentioned other things that are maybe something on the spectrum. You know, a lot of us that are tuned into this topic are really concerned about this cozy relationship with some of the big comm companies in the FCC, and that's why, to a lot of us who are paying attention, this idea of net neutrality is so closely related to information access. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
I believe that net neutrality actually is very important, and I'm upsetting that it was disappeared after the Federal Communication Commission decision, but we still have hope because there is lots of courts related activities, so people are applying to courts, like governors, for example, in several states, like state of Washington, for example. I know because I lived there for many years, and I hope that it will be restored eventually. It's very important because it prevents us from even censorship of online, because internet service providers, technically they can restrict access to some websites or just limit speed of access to websites, so it will be technical censorship.
Which again, it's not direct government censorship.
No,
There's potential for it to be something on that spectrum.
It's not governmental, no, but it's still censorship, so
Well,
we
but
don't want that.
You get some interesting, sure, if Comcast or Cox, you know, to use our local providers, they decide that they don't want us to see this website, so they slow it down or whatever. Why are they doing that? You know, did the government say, you know, maybe you should, you know, your FCC license is coming up for review. Maybe we'll review what you've been doing. You know, so there is a subtle form of censorship without out and out saying it, and that happens all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, the FCC needs to die.
Yes.
I mean, it's a form of censorship.
Yes.
They license broadcast television stations. We once experienced licensing in the country when you had to get a license to have a printing press by the King of England. And, you know, when if the king didn't like what you printed, then he took away your license and you couldn't disseminate your information more. We have that same thing today in America. And it's almost just as insidious. The FCC has punished TV stations, or even the threat of punishment makes them self-censor. And now they're trying to expand this to the internet. And this is a huge issue, and we can't let that happen. It's bad enough it already is going on with broadcast, but once they get the tendrils into the internet, then they'll start legislating content like they do for broadcast.
Well, but
And
there's
it's not
also a problem with, you know, it's always said, leave it to the free market. The free market will fix everything. I think that there is a place for an organization like the FCC, not the way it is now, but you have ownership of multiple broadcast entities, like Sinclair, for example, who will send a message down, and all of the affiliates have to run the same message, a pro-conservative message. And then there's some markets where Sinclair owns everything in that marketplace. So there's not a freedom of choice in that marketplace. And it used to be that the FCC was very careful about ownership in different markets.
You could own 2 radio stations, 1 TV station in the same market, if you will. That's gone now.
And that's the only place where I see an organization like the FCC should take a hand in, is to avoid that complete ownership of an entire city's information system.
Well, and it's not just the government in the sense of the FCC. I've gotten letters, I'm sure Nancy's gotten letters. When you were a working journalist, you got letters. We actually have in our newsroom hate mail bingo.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's just part of the job, and you know, we deal with it. But every once in a while, I get a letter. Somebody doesn't like something I wrote, and they said, "We're telling the FCC what you did." Okay, great. You know, please do. You know, that's fine. I stand behind what I said. But you know, the general public uses that or tries to use that as a threat to get us to write things that they agree with or highlight people in a bad light that they disagree with. So it's fascinating the way the FCC gets used. The president recently said about NBC, we need to have the FCC look at their license.
Yeah.
It can't be done. You know why? NBC doesn't have a license. Individual TV stations have a license, networks do not. So the FCC cannot revoke the license of NBC because NBC does not have a license to revoke yet. You know, they could change the law, but at this point, that can't happen.
Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry, that was.
That's all right.
With regards to like the fake news and the fact like the distrust of media, how do you think that impacts your ability to have an anonymous source and something credible and something that you just say, oh, it's fake news?
It's huge. It makes our job, even with non-anonymous sources. I could interview you about pick a subject. The question, sure. She was asking, with the advent of the cry of fake news, how does it impact us when it comes to using anonymous sources when everything we do that's disagreeable is fake news? everything we do that is disagreeable is fake news. I could interview you about some great accolade that you had, and if somebody doesn't like it, they're going to brand it fake news. You know, that is the new rallying cry. So it doesn't affect my decision whether or not to use an anonymous source or to do a story. My vetting process for anonymous sources and, on the record, non-anonymous sources, because we get lots of bad non-anonymous sources. They have to be vetted also. And the cry of fake news, it irritates me. You know, you want to get me fired up outside of this room, accuse me of being fake news, and we're going to have a fairly hot discussion.
And
But
you're
it doesn't.
hearing it around the world.
Oh, sure, I hear it all the time. What's fascinated me on the subject is, you know, we have the failing New York Times, I can't remember what CNN's nickname is, and terrible NBC. The one or the two networks the president has not gone after yet were always the bastions of the liberal, PBS and NPR. And it fascinates me, he has not attacked them yet. And I don't know if that's a compliment to how balanced we are as a network, or he's just not aware we exist.
He doesn't watch.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm really not sure which it is, but
He
I'm
just
really
knows
not,
my brothers will go after him, so.
you know, so, and I'm not, you know, I don't know which it is, but yeah, fake news, it's just, I'm hoping eventually fake news will no longer be an effective statement because it's being so overused. It's becoming the little boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
And what it's our job as journalists to do is every time we're labeled fake news to prove otherwise. So it does become the little boy who cried wolf, but that's very hard to do.
It actually helps us.
Yeah, in
There's
some ways.
Oh, readership's way up.
Well, there was a study I just reviewed for a journal. They ran 2 experiments and found that if people read, the more tweets they read of President Trump saying fake news, the more they find news credible and the more they want to read or watch news.
Wow.
So the 2 experiments actually found counterintuitive results they didn't even expect it. And essentially what's happening is, and that's among conservatives as well, not just liberals. Everybody, they see enough, and it's reactance theory in psychology. Actually, he's making us out like he's attacking us, and we're victims, and people have sympathy.
And since the 2016 election, PBS and NPR stations around the country, as you know, we run on donations and we're nonprofit. Our membership ranks and our donor ranks have shot straight up. So people are listening and people are coming to our aid. And I see, I'm greatly, there's great comfort in that for me as a journalist.
But what's hurting us is what you brought up earlier, Nancy. It's the media industry's commingling of opinion and news.
Yes.
And that's what's really killing journalism and ruining credibility. And that needs to stop because it's confusing people. I completely understand why people say journalists are biased because we're intentionally mixing that up purely for hits, purely for ratings, for money. And that's just unconscionable and it has to change.
But what I will tell you is people who talk about it's a conspiracy, it's a media conspiracy. Nancy and I sit one desk apart. We can't figure out how to go to lunch together. You know, there is no grand media conspiracy.
There's not.
Reporters are the worst communicators amongst ourselves, you know, and the worst, we can't do anything together. So, you know, it just takes way too many people to have a conspiracy.
Also, when you deal with your sources, whether those are anonymous or non-anonymous, you should always try to triangulate your data, triangulate your sources, which means to check against other independent sources about the same information and then decide whether this is credible information or not, and then decide to publish or not.
If you want to have some fun, take 3 devices. Take your laptop, your tablet, and your phone, and pull the live streams up of the 3 major cable networks and spend an afternoon, preferably a weekday afternoon, watching all three at once, and watch how everybody covers the same event. And what you'll find is they're all a little different, but there are certain things that are the same, which means that's the truth part most likely. It's exactly what he said. It triangulates. You know, if you just read the New York Times, you need to read some more. Or if you just read the Washington Post, you need to read some other
Breitbart.
things.
You should read
You should read Breitbart. It's hysterical. You know, but we have in our newsroom all three cable networks up at all times. You know, I can tell you, I know what all their anchors are and stuff like that. But Fox does pick up some things that are really good that nobody else is picking up. MSNBC picks up some things that are really good that nobody else is picking up. CNN picks up some things that are really good that nobody else picks up. So you have to watch them all. You have to broaden where you get your news from, which is hard. It's time consuming. And it takes some critical thinking on your part to evaluate the data, evaluate the information. But you've got to do it.
I think what we'll do is take questions afterward, but let's give the panel a wonderful applause.
Thank you guys so much for coming. And just before everyone leaves, I just want to remind everyone, if you enjoyed what you saw here tonight, and how could you not, because this was great, then please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at UA Debate Series. And please come to our October 27th event, where we'll be talking about voting rights and whether or not we should extend voting rights to every single citizen. And that would be really great. And thank you guys again so much for coming, and thank you again so much to all of our speakers today.